All right, folks. So can someone just nod so I know that y'all can see my screen? Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Vecca and all our other sponsors for putting this event together. This is my first early childhood day at the legislature, so I'm extremely excited to be here and talking about my favorite subject, universal school meals. So my name is Teddy Waszazak. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Universal School Meals Campaign Manager over at Hunger Free Vermont. So Hunger Free Vermont, as most of you I'm sure know, is an anti-hunger, anti-poverty organization that is focused on systemic changes. We believe that hunger and poverty are both systemic issues that require systemic solutions. And universal school meals, we believe, is an absolutely key part of that. And we also believe that universal school meals are a key tool when it comes to early childhood and childhood development in general. So what I thought I would do today was go through just some general hunger information, some general meal in schools information, looking at things before and since the COVID pandemic, and then go into some of the specifics about the legislation and the program. So just some quick stats on the picture of hunger in Vermont before the pandemic. So before COVID, before the Great Recession, food insecurity had been steadily declining. It spiked during the Great Recession, and it took 12 years to get back down to the pre-recession levels. And that was, compared to COVID, that was basically an economic bump in the road. So we are expecting, to no one's surprise, a long recovery in terms of hunger and food insecurity when it comes to the current levels of hunger. Before the pandemic, the Vermont Food Bank was serving 1 in 4 people in Vermont annually, and that was already an unacceptable level of status quo. With the resources we have, with the systems that we can put in place, it does not make sense that before the pandemic, 1 in 4 people needed help from the food bank, and that 1 in 10-ish individuals in Vermont were experiencing food insecurity. And then we had a global pandemic that disrupted our entire lives, shut down the global economy, and things got really scary. During the pandemic, during the ongoing pandemic, hunger in Vermont has just gotten exponentially worse, to nobody's surprise. We've all seen the images of cars lined up for miles waiting to receive food. We've all seen supply chain issues, especially over the past 6 months. During the ongoing pandemic, 1 in 3 individuals have faced hunger at some point. The pandemic is a very fluid situation, and so too is food insecurity and hunger. Because of the fluid pandemic situation, those who are experiencing food insecurity at any given time in any given wave of different variants, that population shifts. But throughout the course of the entire pandemic, 1 in 3 individuals have faced hunger. From March of 2020 through 2021, individuals utilizing food assistance programs increased by 87%. So that's everything from increased EBT benefits to the summer to the pandemic EBT benefits to a whole range of programs offered through the state, federal government, and local partners. So basically, the amount of people on food assistance programs in that first year nearly doubled. And that's just really insane to think about. That one, since I first read it, has always stuck out to me, that we had such a drastic increase. In this past calendar year, 2021, 27% of people in Vermont faced food insecurity. So that was already then a 17% increase over the pre-pandemic levels, and we saw it took 10 years to recover from the Great Recession. So we expect, with the fluid situation, it to take a significantly long time to recover in terms of food insecurity as well. And the University of Vermont has done some great studies over the past 2 years of the effects of the pandemic on hunger in Vermont. And what we now know from the numbers is that BIPOC individuals, Black, Indigenous, and people of color were 10 times more likely over the course of the pandemic to face food insecurity than were our white neighbors. Families with children, early childhood day at the legislature, here we go. Families with children were 5 times more likely to face food insecurity than those without children. And those who identify as women were 7 times more likely to be food insecure than were men. So what we are seeing with hunger in Vermont during the pandemic is something that I think is obvious to many of us, which shows that the pandemic has just exacerbated pre-existing gaps that existed when it comes to what certain communities are receiving in terms of resources and which others aren't. So taking a step back from hunger and looking at school meals specifically before the pandemic. There were some schools that were already providing universal school breakfast and or lunch. It was around 60 and change, which accounts for 25% of Vermont's public schools. Before the pandemic, in all of the schools that were not serving universal school meals, the shame and the stigma was rampant. It kept students who needed those school meals from eating them, even those students who were eligible for free meals under the previous paid model. Most school nutrition programs require an investment through the school general budget, which is borne in the state education fund. So basically, it should be treated similarly to buses, textbooks, sports equipment, basic education necessities. And before the pandemic, assuming, as we just heard from Polly, knowing that these USDA waivers are unlikely to get extended, what are we looking to go back to? We're looking back to kicking quite a lot of schools off of, more than half of our public schools, off of a universal school meals program. Because of the structure of federal nutrition programs and the demographic and economic situation of the school districts in Vermont, there is not, without a bill that we're going to talk about later or the USDA waivers, outside of a state law and the USDA waivers, there is no good path forward for the remaining public schools who would not otherwise be covered to achieve universal school meals. There are a whole slew of federal grant programs, all of which have very intense and complicated qualifying metrics. And the situation is in Vermont, in most of the remaining school districts, that there is not an easy path. And in most cases, there is no path at all for these otherwise non-universal schools to move to universal. The good news is, though, since the beginning of the pandemic, just about every single, with the exception of, I think, one which does not have a kitchen, all schools in Vermont have been serving universal school meals, breakfast and lunch, every student, every day, at no cost to themselves or their families. The specifics of that, just because Polly already sort of dived into it, so I want to explain it a little bit more, is that the USDA has certain rules, the US Department of Agriculture, which governs food programs, everything from school meals to food stamps at the national level. The USDA issued waivers, which allowed schools to disregard those rules that I was talking about in the last slide. The various metrics and the qualifiers for the federal nutrition programs, all of those got waived so that it didn't matter what your school population looked like. It didn't matter what your demographic information for the school district looked like. You were receiving money. You are now receiving money from the federal government to operate a universal school meals model in your school. And this has been true nationwide. Those waivers covered every state. So since March of 2020, if you have a student in a Vermont public school, your student has been experiencing universal school meals. So what we're proposing is not, in fact, something new that we would have to implement, but it's simply making permanent what's been true for the past 2 years. The school meals have been a source of stability for students, families, and schools during a time of constant stress and uncertainty. Going back earlier to what I talked about with the pandemic being a fluid situation, things are changing in schools. Anyone who has kids knows that the situation in schools has been incredibly unstable, especially over the past 6 months, with mask advice being different all over the place, with different spikes and variants in different communities. The one thing that has been constant since day one of the pandemic, the folks who never worked from home, going into the next bullet, are the school nutrition professionals, the folks who make and prepare and delivered, when they were doing delivery, delivered these meals every day. They never stopped. And they have been working incredibly hard over the past 2 years in incredibly difficult circumstances to make sure students have the food they need. Over the past year, I've been in this job just around a year. I have gotten to talk to so many amazing school nutrition professionals who just have the most amazing stories about getting the call the day before that their school was going to be shut down, but they needed to figure out a way to get the kids the meals they needed, because they knew that oftentimes the 2 meals, the breakfast and lunch, are the only 2 meals that student will receive that day. It's an unfortunate truth, but it is a truth that we know from talking to folks on the ground in schools every day. And specifically, the school nutrition person that I'm thinking of, he and his team got together via Zoom. They huddled that evening, made a plan, and the next day, the next morning, they were out in the courtyard of their school. They had they had put up tents to protect things. They had wheeled the equipment out of the kitchen. They had found a way to pick up takeout containers. And they, in the courtroom on a chilly March day in the courtyard outside, on a chilly March day in Vermont, they cooked hundreds of school meals and then got those school meals delivered to each individual student's house. And that's just remarkable. And that's just some of the ingenuity that we've seen from folks who work, from school nutrition professionals to teachers to administrators. The creativity and the ingenuity and the amazing work that they have done over the past 2 years is just incredibly moving. And I think that we have to center ourselves in that and remember that when they raise their voices to advocate for permanent universal school meals. I went on an unscripted tangent there, but I felt like it was important that folks hear that story because I think it's really amazing. And talking about school food programs, last year, the legislature passed local food purchasing incentives for schools. Basically, if your school buys 15% of its food from a local grower, you get an extra 15 cents per meal. 20% local food gets you an extra 20 cents per meal, 25%, 25 cents, etc. Those grants, which were specifically passed last year and are in the governor's budget this year, those grants, as well as additional food purchasing programs that have been in place before those grants, have helped schools, and specifically school nutrition professionals in their offices, have allowed schools to buy good, local, nutritious food, despite the rising costs and the supply chain disruptions that we have seen over the past 6 months. So because we are making these investments in our local, in our food and local food purchasing programs, we have allowed our school nutrition professionals to operate without having to sacrifice quality for rising costs or supply chain disruptions. And that's been really important too. I saw from the Milton School District, they had an entire Valentine's Day themed menu with little heart-shaped chicken parmesans and peppermint ice cream bars that were bright pink, and just some really cool stuff that's been coming out. So we've been talking about universal school meals, different versions, different images of hunger across the state, different versions of what a school meal program could look like. But why should we do universal school meals? Why is universal school meals, and why would making them permanent in Vermont be a good thing? Well, first of all, we just heard that Washington's not going to do it for us and extend the waivers again. So we should do it because Washington won't. So I'll start with that one. But going into some of the numbers here, there have been many studies and surveys done over the past couple of years and nationally in other schools that have been serving universal school meals for many years before this. And the numbers show that universal school meals is both beneficial and wanted in our schools all across Vermont. So first off, universal school meals improves students' performance in math and English language arts by up to 10 weeks of learning, which is around the same time as the summer break. Summer break's a little bit longer, but we hear the statistics about students losing information, about them losing certain amounts of weeks of learning over the summer breaks. And it is shown that universal school meals increases that number by 10 weeks. So it gives them basically an extra 10 weeks in their knowledge bank for when they go into the summer and they start losing things, like we all do. As I mentioned earlier, from March of 2020 through March of 2021, those people accessing food assistance programs increased by almost 90%, the 87% number. And households with children were more likely to access those programs than those without. So in other words, of the almost 90% of people who newly signed up for food assistance programs in that year, if you picked a random individual out of there, it was more likely to be a household with children than those without, which makes sense. Households with children have higher food bills, etc. In a recent survey that the School Nutrition Association did, 96%, almost every single one of school nutrition professionals are interested in making universal school meals permanent when the federal waivers ends. Which just to me means the folks who actually have to do this work, the folks who are in the kitchens every day, who are talking to the kids every day, and who are doing all of the background work to use these local purchasing grants and do all the other amazing things they do. 96% of them want this program to stay in place. And I think we should listen to them. Prior to the pandemic, 64% of the Vermont schools providing USM had increased their local purchasing incentives. So before the pandemic, of all the schools that were running universal school meals already, 64% of them increased their local purchasing incentive. So, and then that's a direct tie because they were operating on a universal school meals model, their participation went up. They were serving more kids. In the way these programs are set up, schools get reimbursed on a per plate basis. So the more school meals that you serve, the more money that your program is getting in from the federal and the state government. Therefore, when you're feeding more kids through universal school meals, you have more money, plus the local purchasing incentives. You can now afford to buy a whole bunch of food from your local farmers and help support the local economy while also providing children with fresh, delicious, and more nutritious meals. And finally, in that same survey done by SNA, asking about universal school meals, 90% of parents, teachers, and school nutrition professionals, so 90% of each of those individual categories, identified direct benefits to universal school meals, including more nutritious food, an improved social climate, both in the cafeteria as well as in the classrooms. There were less behavioral issues. There were less visible signs of hunger. As well as better educational outcomes. The kids are performing better in school because they have universal school meals. And I'll plug our website later. There are a ton of other statistics that help back up the case for universal school meals. We just picked out 5 of the most stark that were here. But if you go on our website, which I'll show you later, there is a ton of other information as well. And this is the other why for universal school meals. And we've kind of already talked about it, but this is one image that sums it up. We call this the virtuous cycle. And what the virtuous cycle is a vision for school meals, for farm to school and early childhood, and for local purchasing for local farmers that all work together to create basically one big program. And while they are separate pieces of legislation, for example, the local purchasing incentives passed last year, while we're working to pass universal school meals this year, they all work together and they're all vital pieces of the same vision, which helps address food insecurity. So first we have universal school meals, which is an investment in our kids. It is a statement that school nutrition is a vital part of our education system. Universal school meals increases participation in students, which helps schools maximize the amount of federal funding that they're drawing down. Fully funded farm to school and early childhood grants programs put in place strong foundations, strong frameworks for actually pulling the levers that are needed to operate a farm to school system, that are needed to pull those early childhood. We've all seen early childhood centers sharing facilities with elementary schools or K-8 schools, whatever it is. Then those early childhood folks can help participate in the school meals program. Those two things work together. Local purchasing incentives to support farmers and school meal programs help support the local economy. It helps create, I don't want to say a political bond, but a community bond between farmers in a community, school staff, school professionals, and students and families. All of them are working together to make this work. The local farmers do business with the schools. They get more money in. We help support our local farms and keep them open and thriving. They then support more healthy and nutritious foods to our schools. So our students are eating better, the stuff they're eating tastes better, and they are getting better educational outcomes and better behavioral issues, which we know has a direct effect on home life and on the community. So those three things all work together to create the virtuous cycle. So we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of the legislation here. And let's see. I was just checking for questions before I continued talking at you. All right, cool. So the legislation that we are proposing, it is legislation to reach every student with every meal, every school day. Under our legislation, S100, all public schools would be required to provide universal breakfast and universal lunch to all students every day at no cost to their students or families. And as I said earlier, this would simply make permanent the system that has been in place since March of 2020, meaning there would be no cash registers in cafeterias. There would continue to be that source of stability for families and schools. And actually, while I'm saying that out loud, one other stat that we didn't end up putting in that graphic, but that's very stark, is that a majority, 50% plus one, of parents who answered that survey about universal school meals, I don't remember the exact number, but I know it was more than half, expressed significant concern about the economic effect that it would have on their family if they had to go back to paying for school meals every day. And we know that we had structures in place to protect the most vulnerable of our populations. The most vulnerable of our children were already getting free school meals. But we also all know that there are a huge chunk of people. I was talking to one individual who made literally $900 too much annually. Out of the whole year, they made $900 too much to qualify for school meals. And that's a huge added bill for them. That's hard for families to keep up with. So I can't stress enough how much of a sense of stability school meals have been for families across Vermont and across the country. School meals would be required to maximize their participation and design their programs using best practices to maximize the participation in school meals by the students, such as breakfast after the bell, which I'm sure most of you know is a model where basically breakfast is served in your morning homeroom. In order to ensure that they're receiving their maximum federal reimbursements. So in other words, even without the USDA waivers, we know from research, from experience, that certain practices are more likely to increase your participation. So schools would be required to use the best practice that is best for their school, because every school is different, in order to maximize the federal funding that they are getting from Washington. So the more meals you serve, the more money you get from the federal government, and the less this ultimately costs the state of Vermont at the end of the day. Which gets us to school meal program costs, which are not covered by federal reimbursements, limited state funding, and other funding sources. So you have the reimbursements from the federal government. There are some state grants that do go outside of the education fund that do go directly to schools, and other funding sources, which is something I learned when I took this job. This is not something I knew before, but many of our school nutrition offices will also do things like catering to bring in some extra money throughout the year to help supplement their programs and keep costs low for the kids. So any costs that are not covered by one of those three categories would come off the top of the state education fund, just like all the other educational supports we talked about earlier, the buses, the textbooks, and the sports. This accomplishes, taking it off the top from the state education fund, accomplishes basically two big things. The first thing it accomplishes is it prevents these costs from being passed directly to school budgets. So rather than if your local school budget, I live in Barrie, we notoriously like to vote down school budgets in Barrie. If we had to pay for the universal school meal system in the school budget that we take to the voters and they vote it down, well, there's a law saying we have to do universal school meals, so maybe now we have to cut athletic programs, arts programs, or classes because we can't afford to do both and we're required to do USM. This prevents any of that from happening. And the other thing it does is it states that school meals are a integral part, are a vital part of the education system. You cannot have all the vital educational supports that we offer are paid through the education fund. By not putting school meals in the education fund, you're basically saying that school meals are not an educational necessity. And if there's anything we've learned over the past 2 years, it's that school meals are absolutely an educational necessity. So I don't know why my thing isn't working. Oh, there we go. Cool. Where is this legislation now? So in the Senate last April, the Senate passed a watered down version of S100, which only included universal breakfast and a couple other pieces. The couple other pieces, such as the local purchasing incentive, such as the task force to study universal school lunch, our favorite thing in the world, legislative task forces, those were both passed into law in other pieces of legislation. So last session, when it became clear S100 wasn't going to get over the finish line, they took a couple other chunks of it, stuck it in another bill, and passed them there. So this year, S100 still exists, and it's still been passed by the Senate. It just, as of right now, still only requires universal breakfast. As of right now, and that's Wednesday at like 10:30. This will change very soon. This year, on this February 27th, just a couple weeks ago, Senator Chris Pearson, who's one of the champions of the bill, introduced the bill to the House Education Committee and gave them a quick walkthrough. So where we are right now is in the House Education Committee, S100 is there, and it began receiving testimony from Senator Pearson on February 27th. This week is a huge week for S100 and very well timed for the ECDL. So I know we all can read the tea leaves very well, and I know VECA planned to have this event during S100 testimony week, so I thank them for that. But all week, we started yesterday and going all the way till 2 o'clock on Friday, we will be in House Education testifying about S100. We brought in the Maine and California have both passed permanent universal school. California was first. They beat Maine by a couple weeks. We, of course, in Vermont have much more in common with Maine than we do with the state of California. So we had and it passed unanimously, I will say, out of both chambers. Universal school meals passed by unanimous consent in Maine, which was amazing to hear. We had the Democratic and the Republican leader of the Maine State Senate come in yesterday, and they talked to the House Education Committee in strong support of universal school breakfast and lunch. And we will continue, testimony will be heard today, and a huge day of witnesses for us on Thursday coming as well. So very big week with S100. This is where things stand right now. But we are asking, of course, the House Education Committee to the most important pieces of these bills, the two big things that have to be done, is we have to include both breakfast and lunch, and the funding has to come from the education fund. Those are two things that are vital to this bill. They can mess with the grammar of it all they want. But as long as we have breakfast and lunch on a universal no-cost basis and the funding comes from the education fund, we will have accomplished universal school meals in Vermont. So stay tuned and tune in to the House Education Committee tomorrow starting at 9 a.m. for an action-packed 6 hours of universal school meals testimony. So how can you help universal school meals? You've seen the slideshow, you've heard about universal school meals, and like me, you are ready to just jump in and dedicate your whole life to universal school meals. And we are so excited about having you on the campaign. So you can go to universalschoolmealsvt.org and join the campaign. Everything about the campaign lives on the website. You can sign up to volunteer, you can make a donation to the campaign, you can send one of those contact us emails if you just have questions and want to talk to us. You can identify yourself as a parent, a teacher, a school nutrition professional, and lend your voice to the campaign. So many things to do, all housed on the website. Today, you can talk to your legislators when we go into our breakout rooms later about S100, the Universal School Meals for All bill, and the need to include both breakfast and lunch in that bill. So if when you go into these breakout rooms later and your legislators inevitably ask like, oh, what'd you guys hear? What stood out to you? I would really encourage you, especially this week. Like I said, they're talking about this right now. So if they can hear pass S100, universal school meals, breakfast and lunch, we want them to hear that as much as possible this week. You can tell your legislators specifically why you care about universal school meals by signing a supporter card and using the supporter card toolkit to encourage others to sign supporter cards. A supporter card is basically like signing a petition, but we also have a little box where you can write your own why as to why you care about universal school meals. That lives on our website. If you are a business owner, if you work for a nonprofit or some other organization, you can sign on to the organizational support letter we have. We have a list of well over 100 organizations that have signed on officially in support of universal school meals. And this includes everyone from big employers like Ben & Jerry's and Cabot to places like Let's Grow Kids, of course, VBSR, Main Street Alliance. So a huge and wonderful family, a big community of businesses, organizations, nonprofits, other campaigns that have come together to support universal school meals. You can share your support for universal meals on your social media. You can send links to the website via email. You can write a letter to the editor about your local paper or to your local paper. And then, of course, if there is something else you're passionate about, if you're an artist and you love creating, if you're a graphic designer and you want to help in that way, as an organizer, I'm very much committed to meeting people where they're at and helping people do the things that they want to do. So if you have some other idea that I have not mentioned, if you want to, metaphorically throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, if you, whatever you are passionate about, we can find a way to fit you into the Universal School Meals campaign. That's something I believe very deeply. So please feel free to reach out anytime. And this is just a quick screenshot of our website. We have, it actually says learn, donate, and act instead of learn, act, and support now, but you get the gist. If you go to the website, universalschoolmealsvt.org, there are 3 action buttons right at the top where you can learn about the campaign, you can donate to the campaign, or you can take action on the campaign. All very self-explanatory and aesthetically pleasing. And then this is just my contact information. I'll drop it in the chat as well so you have it written down. But again, my name is Teddy Waszazak, Universal School Meals Campaign Manager with Hunger Free Vermont. That's my email and my cell phone. You can shoot me an email, give me a call, or shoot me a text anytime. I will do my best to respond to you in a timely manner. And thank you all so much for coming in today and listen to me chat at you about my all-time favorite subject, universal school meals. And I would be more than happy to answer any other questions. And I think I'll stop sharing now so we don't have to stare at the white screen. Great. Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm also just going to drop my info here. and then make sure I'm sending it to everybody. Excellent. So again, I just wrote down my contact info there. And like I said, happy to answer any questions now. But also if you are like me and you think of random questions when you're trying to sleep at 1 a.m., I do that all the time. You can shoot me a 1 a.m. email and I will answer it. Yes. Yeah, Amy, I agree. The stigma and the getting rid of the cash register is just so huge. I'm not so far removed from high school that I don't remember. I was a free and reduced kid when I went to school. And schools have definitely come a long way in trying to reduce the stigma around it. But I mean, kids are smart. I think we don't give kids enough credit. They are smart and they can figure out, you know, who needs help and who doesn't. And a universal school meals model just eliminates all of that and says, hey, you're at school today, so you get a breakfast and a lunch. Congratulations. And I know some parents also feel strongly about packing their own lunches and sending kids with their own lunches. And it's a nice, bonding. It's part of the routine that they do every day. Well, God love you. Continue to send your kid with a lunchbox like you have been. But if you are a single mom with 2 kids and you wake up 5 minutes late and you don't have time to throw all the stuff in the lunchbox, or if it is a tight week with groceries and gas prices, and you don't have that extra $5 on a Friday, you're no longer making the choice between $5 more in groceries or putting out that $5 so your kid can eat that day. You know that going to school, those meals are just going to be there.